Okay, welcome everybody. My name's Bryce Wakefield. I'm an associate here at the Asia program of the Woodrow Wilson Centre. Today's event on demographic trends and policy implications in Northeast Asia will be brought to you by the Asia program and also the Environmental Change and Security program. I think we'll try and keep things quick because I realise a lot of you might want to get home. So I'll just introduce the speakers and then let's get started. Our first speaker is Jocelyn Finlay. She's a research associate at the Harvard School of Public Health in the Department of Global Health and Population. She's a former fellow of the program on the global demography and aging and serves on the International Union for Scientific Study of Population panel on the economic consequences of aging. She took up a postdoctoral fellowship at Harvard after she finished her PhD at Australia National University. Our next speaker is Ito Pung. She's Professor of Sociology and Associate Dean of Interdisciplinary and International Affairs at the Faculty of Arts and Sciences at Toronto University. So she's used to the snow, I guess. And she's taught at LSE, the London School of Economics, Hokuei Gakuin University, and Kansei Gakuin University School of Political Studies. She received her PhD from the LSE, where she also taught. Richardson Cotter is demographer in residence at the Stimson Centre. His research focuses on demographic transition and human migration and the relationship to civil conflict, political regimes, natural resource dynamics and health. He's published at a number of fora, including Foreign Policy, Nature and Science. He is also a very important consultant. He consults with various institutions around Washington, including the Wilson Center's Environmental Change and Security program. Right, so without further ado, I ask Jocelyn to kick off.
Great, thank you, Bryce. Oh. Does this work, actually? Is it working?
Yep,
oh.
yep.
Thank you, Bryce, and thank you to the Woodrow Wilson Centre for inviting me to come and talk to you today about demographic change and economic growth in Northeast Asia. And thank you to all of you for braving the weather and staying for this session that we've got happening today. So it's no great secret that particularly in Asia and particularly in Northeast Asian countries, that they have rocketed forward in terms of GDP per capita growth rates for over the period from 1960 through to the present. Northeast Asian countries were amongst the world's strongest in terms of the average annual growth rate of GDP per capita. We can see Taiwan, Korea, China and Japan up there in terms of the highest GDP per capita growth over the last 45 years. This stellar growth throughout the Northeast Asian countries has been attributed to some key factors: trade openness, high savings, a real value placed on education, effective macroeconomic policy, but also, as has been published by myself and my colleagues at the Harvard School of Public Health, including David Bloom and David Canning, there's another factor that has actually been shown to attribute up to 30% of the Northeast Asian growth miracle from 1960 through to the present, and that is demographic change. This important connection between demographics and economic growth can be projected into the future, and we can shed light on prospects and challenges that the region may face. So let me just step back a moment and consider what I actually mean by demographics. There are two fundamental demographic phenomena that are often discussed in the context of the effect of demographic change on economic growth. The first is the demographic transition, and the second is the demographic dividend. So the demographic transition has been occurring or has occurred in all countries around the world. the demographic transition is initiated by a decline in mortality, particularly child mortality. With a decrease in mortality, we then observe a decline in fertility. In high mortality environments, fertility preferences are high as parents want to ensure that some of their children will actually survive. The preference to have a high number of surviving children is in part to ensure that at least one of your children will survive and look after you in old age. As child mortality declines and as credit markets mature, preferences for a high number of children declines and fertility rates continue to fall. As this fertility declines, the number of dependents relative to the number of working age people decreases, and the increase in life expectancy, although great, as we've seen in Northeast Asia, is not sufficient to offset the effects of falling fertility. So to understand the effects of demographic change on economic growth, an important and a direct channel is to consider the number of workers relative to the number of dependents. As fertility rates fall, the number of working age people relative to the number of youth age dependents will actually increase. And with this increase, mechanically, GDP per capita will also increase, as there are fewer dependents to rely on the same amount of output that those workers are producing. But the effect of demographic change on income per capita doesn't stop there with that mechanical effect. In other research that I've been conducting, we're looking at the effect of a decrease in fertility on female labour supply. With fewer children to look after, this frees up time for women to work in the labour market. Other research shows that as life expectancy increased, we would expect that working lives would also increase, although, as I'll show later, we actually haven't been observing this. And with an increase in life expectancy also comes an increase in savings as the retirement period extends. So each of these factors, female labour supply, old age labour supply, and savings, also have varying effects on income per capita growth. So let's just have a look at the Northeast Asian experience in particular. So throughout the region, we've seen increases in life expectancy. So this shows graphs for each of the 4 countries, China, Japan, Korea, and Taiwan. And we see those dramatic increases in life expectancy over the period 1960 through to the present. I use the CIA World Factbook for the latest figures, but these historical figures actually come from the World Development Indicators. So the most recent figures from the CIA World Factbook indicate that life expectancy in Japan is now 82.17, Korea at 78, Taiwan 78, and in China slightly lower at 74. These increases in life expectancy mean that the number of people surviving beyond the age of 65 is increasing. So while the increases in life expectancy will have an increasing influence on demographic change and age structure in the future, the driver of demographic change over the past 50 years has been the dramatic decline in fertility rates in the region. Throughout the 60s, 70s, and early 80s, fertility rates have plummeted in Korea and Taiwan. For China, fertility rates dropped sharply as one-child policy came onto the agenda in the late 1970s. This decline in fertility is of monumental proportion. Fertility rates now rest below replacement for each of the Northeast Asian countries. Latest figures, again from the CIA World Factbook, indicate that Taiwan has the 4th lowest fertility rate in the world, with 1.15 children per woman of reproductive age. And it's 4th in the world, and its close neighbours, Macau, Hong Kong, and Singapore, have fertility rates of close to 1. Japan has 5th lowest with 1.2 children per woman, and Korea has 6th lowest with 1.22. China is up the scale a little bit with 1.54. So a steady decline in the fertility rate will increase those working age shares that I was talking about before, as the number of youth dependents falls relative to the number of working age individuals. So it is this sharp rise in the working age share driven by that rapid fertility decline that has had a direct positive effect on GDP per capita in the Northeast Asian region from 1960 through to the present. But once fertility rates stabilise, the number of individuals entering the workforce will also stabilise. Increasing life expectancy and thus the rise in the old age dependence will then combine with a stable youth and working age population to reduce the working age to non-working age population ratio. So here in this slide, I'm just showing what the increase in the working age population, working age shares. Sorry, I was on the wrong slide. The increase in the working age shares from 1960 through to the present. And it's driven by that dramatic decrease in the fertility rates. So in previous work that I've published in the Asian Economic Policy Review, I've estimated the effects of changes in the working age shares and population growth on GDP per capita growth, with the aim of deciphering the contribution of demographic change on economic growth. In this article, I found that over the 1965 to 2005 period, China experienced an average annual growth rate of 5.52%. So looking at this figure here. Over that period, working age population grew at a rate of 2.12%. Here. Population growth at 1.55% per annum. And so using the estimated effects of the working age and population growth on GDP per capita that I was able to do through a regression analysis, I calculated that 25% of the growth experience in China over the period is attributed to demographic change. Japan, you see, has a lower contribution because as we saw in the previous graphs, its fertility decline happened well before that of its neighbours in China, Korea and Taiwan. So we see the strong growth of its neighbours, particularly Korea and Taiwan, of similar contributions to GDP per capita growth. Dramatic increases in the working age shares have contributed significantly to the growth performance observed in Northeast Asia. So in Korea, nearly 30% of the growth experience over the 1965 to 2005 period can be attributed to demographic change. So with predictions of modest changes in fertility and mortality, demographers can project changes in the composition of the population over time. With this, we can see how changes in demographics of the Northeast Asian countries will influence economic growth in the years to come. So here's the extension of the graph that I showed you before. So before I showed you the upswing of the working age shares, so basically seeing to the peak. So, and then those increases in the working age shares, I told you, contributed 20 to 30% of the growth experience in Northeast Asia. But this miracle is about to end. So what was a miracle in the 1960 to 2005 period will now become a curse as those working age shares are set to decline. So, so here's about 2010 here. So for China, they're going to reach the peak at about 2020. Japan well and truly passed its peak in terms of the number of working age individuals compared to the dependents. Korea is at the turning point now. It actually reached it in 2010. And Taiwan, the reason why Taiwan looks slightly different is that I got these figures from a slightly different source, from a Taiwanese source, as opposed to the World Population Prospects. But still, we see that their peak is about to come in a few years. So with the stabilisation of fertility, it may seem that demographic shifts will be minor and of no consequence to economic performance. And if you just consider the fertility rate, then maybe you would think that that is the case. But the composition of the age distribution within a country is a function of past variation in birth and death rates and the evolution of those cohorts through the age distribution. So just as growth of the working age share had a positive effect on economic growth, we can predict, given the ongoing importance of demographic factors in explaining economic growth in Northeast Asia, that the decline in the working age shares will have a negative effect on economic performance in the region in the years to come. So with this fact that the working age shares are set to decline and population growth will also decline, these demographic forces are going to draw down on GDP per capita growth. So what I've predicted here is that from whatever growth rate China achieves from the present through to 2050, 0.3 percentage points will actually be shaved off due to these demographic forces, in particular the declining working age shares. 1.08 percentage points will be shaved off Japan's economic growth performance, and 0.97 percentage points will be shaved off Korea's, and a massive 1.49 percentage points will be shaved off Taiwan's growth of GDP per capita. So the miracle of the latter part of the 20th century will become a curse in the early parts of the 21st century. However, the projections that I make assume that there'll be no behavioural response to the demographic change that's occurring. The exact nature of these behavioural responses is not so obvious. For even though the working age share is forecast to peak and then decline, a working age share of 2.0, so on the upswing of the working age graph that I showed you, in 1990, is very different from a working age share of 2.0 that will come in around 2025 in many of the Northeast Asian countries. The reason for this is that the ratio of old to young will increase significantly, so that the dependent population will shift from one that is weighted more by the youth to one that is more weighted by the elderly. Fertility has stabilised below replacement, and life expectancy will increase further if current trends continue. We can only hypothesise over the behavioural response, as the increase in the elderly share will dominate the dependent population in the future. For example, with a decline in fertility the rise in the old age population, behavioural responses such as an increase in female labour force participation and an increase in old age labour force participation can act to mitigate the negative effects on economic growth of a decline in the working age share as projected throughout the Northeast Asian region. So governments in the Republic of Korea and Japan have had moments of reflection on the low fertility rates and the consequence of the size of the future workforce. But rising fertility rates is not the only option for government policy, and if we account for female labour force participation response, then high fertility could have a damaging effect on economic growth. And while I focused on a predicted decline of the working age share, the implied concern is over the size of the labour force. Policies to encourage women into paid work can act to increase the total labour force. Moreover, with the increase in life expectancy, as we are also experiencing a compression of morbidity. And so we would expect, as life expectancy increases, that we could also increase the working life. Although we're not observing that, and I'll go through that in a little bit later. Another option is to increase migrant workers, and I'll go through this now as we go through the graphs. So in terms of female labour force participation, and indeed male labour force participation of the 25 to 64-year-old age groups, we see here that female labour force participation has been increasing, and in the future there may be further increases, and well and truly should be encouraged. So we see that the change between 1950 and 2000, it's increased in China, Japan, and Korea. So contrary to our priors that an increase in life expectancy would lead to an increase in the retirement age, we actually observe a decline, particularly in male labour supply, of the older ages. This actually compounds the negative effects of an ageing population. Not only is there an increasing number of people above the age of 65, but fewer of them are choosing to work. We actually also observe that between the ages of 55 and 64, that the proportion of men working in this bracket is also decreasing. But in the Northeast Asian countries, that's not as dramatic as, say, in France, where really the drop-off has declined to around 25% for that age group. So as I said, another way to mitigate the fall and bolster the working age share is to promote inward migration. But Past experience indicates that China and Korea actually have an outward migration, and Japan has a very small inward migration relative to what would be needed to compensate the massive decline in the working age population. So in the past, the East Asian countries have exhibited remarkable flexibility to change and adapt to embrace new opportunities. So with the known influence of demographic factors on economic performance and the imminent decline of the working age share, now is not the time for East Asia to rest on its laurels. It is a time for change and required flexibility to adopt policies to maintain the relative size of the labour force to dependence. East Asia has shown in the past that it is able to make such adjustments, and I would encourage this determination to continue. Thank you.
Thank you, Jocelyn. Okay.
That's a good discussion. Thank you. I don't have PowerPoint, but thank you very much. I also want to follow Jocelyn's thanks by thanking Bryce and the Woodrow Wilson Center for inviting me to come here and give this presentation. I'm also glad that Jocelyn had sort of provided a very good overview of what is happening in terms of demographic changes in Northeast Asia over the last half a century. And I'm particularly glad that you had mentioned about these given demographic data, because that is the kind of data that I will be using in my presentation as well. As Jocelyn said, population aging in East Asia is a result, I think, of two important factors. The first is the increased longevity rate, which is good news. The second, and I think more importantly, and becoming increasingly more important, is that rapid decline in fertility and the very low fertility rate. So as Jocelyn showed in her presentation, we're talking about the fertility rate that's ranging between 1.0 to 1.3, with the exception of China being 1.54. Northeast Asian countries of Japan, China, South Korea, and Taiwan have been experiencing rapid population aging since around 1970s and 80s. Japan was the first to recognize the demographic change, and they began to take policy measures toward this toward the end of the 1980s. Since the end of the 1990s, China, South Korea, and Taiwan also have begun to realize the gravity of their demographic situation. Now, saying that, I should also mention population aging is not unique to Northeast Asia. It is a pretty well universal phenomena amongst almost all the industrialized advanced economies. But what makes the Northeast Asian situation so unique and important are two factors: the speed and the gravity of the change. In terms of the speed of the change, most Western countries have been aging gradually throughout the 20th century. For example, France aged, it took France over 100 years to shift the population of their over 65 age group from proportion of the 65 plus population to change from 7% to 14%. For many Western European countries, it took them several decades to make that demographic shift. In Japan, it took about 2.5 decades after 1970s. And in South Korea, it took them just 14 years. So you're talking about a very rapid population change. This is quite astounding. Now, in terms of the magnitude, well, just imagine China. We're talking here about a seismic shift in the demographic makeup of a significant proportion of the world population. So what's happening in terms of demographic changes in Northeast Asia is pretty significant. And it will have significant implications for not only these nations, but for the rest of the world as well. So what are some of the social policy or welfare state implications of demographic changes for these countries? There are quite a lot. But today, I am only going to focus on 3 issues that I think are really, really important. Their dependency ratio, the increased care burden, and what I will call labor and population management. Let me start with the increasing dependency ratio. This is the reverse side of the demographic dividend that Jocelyn was talking about. What made these 4 countries' economic growth so strong in the 60s, 70s, and 80s is now coming undone and becoming a burden. Dependency ratio is defined as a ratio of people over the age of 65, normally the retired people in these countries, to the number of working age population. Increased dependency ratio will mean that there will be fewer working age population to support the growing number of the retired population. Population aging will have serious implications for these countries in terms of pension, particularly in countries like Korea, where the pensionable age is around 60. Japan just lifted the pension age to 65. Healthcare will be impacted, and it would also have implications for social welfare. These 4 Northeast Asian countries are considered the so-called lean welfare states, meaning the governments in these countries spend relatively little in social security and social welfare. And therefore, the social security system and public social welfare in these countries are not very generous, nor very well developed. As the dependency ratio increases, the demand for pension, health care, and social welfare will increase. The governments in these countries will have to deal with these issues. And the most likely way that they will deal with it, the most obvious options will be to raise taxes and the social insurance contributions of the current and future working age population. Now, this is a politically very sensitive issue because these governments will have to make sure that they could provide support for their increasing aging population, at the same time doing this without overburdening their working population. Let me now move to the issue of increased care burden. Now, increased need for elder care as a result of population aging in these countries is no-brainer. It's very obvious. But there is other forms of care that these aging societies will have to address. And by that, I mean childcare and family support. childcare, you might ask. Why would they have to worry about childcare? Well, the reason is that the population aging in Northeast Asia is happening precisely in the context of other structural changes that are taking place in these societies, and some of which Jocelyn has already alluded to. In fact, some of these structural changes are the very root causes of the fertility decline and hence the population aging. And so together, they actually work in a very negatively creating a negative feedback system. The structural changes that I'm talking about are the decline in male breadwinner household arrangements, increased women's labor market participation, including that of the married women. By the way, the women's labor market participation rate for 25 to 45 age group in Taiwan in 2010 was over 80%. Also included in the structural changes are increased educational level and increased internationalization. And finally, with those changes in ideas about family and gender relations. Given these structural changes, what happens is that as the economic structures of these countries began to shift from what was predominantly manufacturing and industrial economy to more services and knowledge-based economy, more women will be drawn into the labor market. In order to enable them to work, we will then need to have childcare and other kinds of family support systems in order to help them reconcile their work and family responsibilities. In fact, studies show that one of the main reasons why these countries are experiencing such low fertility rate is that childcare and family support systems in these countries are so inadequate that women have very little option but to choose either to work and have a career or quit work and have family. Not surprisingly, more and more women in these countries are choosing to work and have a career. This in turn makes it even more difficult for them to have family and children. So the governments in these countries will have to think about childcare and other family support, not just because the demands for these services will continue to rise, but also because from a strategic policy point of view, this will be a very smart social policy investment to better mobilize women's human capital and at the very same time incentivize people to have more children. And in fact, that's what many of these countries have started doing. Introducing universal child care system, introducing family work harmonization policies, providing incentives for women and young families to have children. Now, as Jocelyn's presentation mentioned, pronatalism and raising fertility is not the only policy option. And it is on this that my third issue rests on. The third point of labor and population management. As I said, the speed and magnitude of population aging means that there is going to be a huge increase in demand for care in many of these Northeast Asian countries. Already we know that there are shortage of care workers in many of these countries, Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan. And in fact, we also know that in the recent years, many of these countries have begun to take in migrant workers from Southeast Asia from places such as the Philippines and Indonesia. These people are coming in to fill in the gap for the lack of care workers. At the very same time, we also have data that international marriages between Japanese, Korean, and Taiwanese men and Southeast Asian women have increased tremendously over the last decade or so. And some studies shows that in many of these cases, these marriages are an indirect way for these men to recruit family care workers. Now, these will have a huge implication for the multicultural makeup of these countries. It will not only create a real challenge for these countries' multicultural and immigration policies, but for countries such as Japan and South Korea that had long considered themselves as single nation, single race, single ethnic, and homogeneous societies, this will be a real shock to their sense of national identity. Already debates has begun in these countries. So in conclusion, I just wanted to summarize. I pointed out three implications of the population aging for social policy and welfare state in Northeast Asia. Increased dependency ratio, increased care burden, and a real challenge to labor and population management. I think these will be the next big policy agenda for these Northeast Asian countries. Okay, I'll stop here. Thanks.
Thank you, Professor Finn.
Thank you. How do I do that?
That's forward, back.
Okay. Something didn't happen there. Okay, that doesn't matter. So, anyway, what was supposed to be on there was just a map, and the map is obvious, you know, Northeast Asia. The point being was, in terms of defense, I was going to talk about three countries: Japan, Taiwan, and South Korea. And the game is already up for, in terms of defense, for Taiwan and South Korea. They are geographically juxtaposed to their to states that consider them to be part of their state, that have claims on their sovereignty. So they are largely committed to the defense, above all, of their territory. And Japan is somewhat of an outlier. Japan is out of the sphere of, no one has a claim on Japan's territory except minor claims, say, in the south. And Japan, for many decades of the 20th century, after post-war, had an accommodationist perspective about China. It delivered aid, it invested heavily, it made accommodations for China trade, and it largely, in the end, decided that that may have been a mistake. And now we're entering a period where, as we saw not too long ago, earlier this week, I think that, or no, it was in September, was that Japan Maritime Self-Defense Force confronted the Chinese fishing vessels in the southern islands, Senkaku, and there is, there's an issue, at least at Japan asserting itself, at least. You don't think so, but at least the news media does. So we'll see. Anyway, I don't think that Japan is going to be much of the accommodationist that it was before. And we'll see what happens. Japan has done something in terms of participating in peacekeeping. There's about eight times in the last 10 years that it's participated. That's something. Had a 2-year stint in Iraq, uneventful, hardly left the base. But nonetheless, it's difficult for Japan to build its self-defense force and to assert itself in the wake of World War II. But don't forget that this was a country that it really is hard to believe that 100 years ago took Russia, destroyed the Russian Eastern Fleet and was able to obtain accessions from in Manchuria from the Russian government, and then it brought the U.S. and the British Empire virtually to its knees at one point at the beginning of World War II. So it's not a country that has no experience in military experience at all. It's one that has been there before. This chart somehow shifted a little bit. The point of it has been covered. The fact is that Japan, Korea, and Taiwan have TFRs and life expectancies. E0 is life expectancies and infant mortality rates that are comparable to Southern Europe. They're European levels, and low fertility is something that Southern Europe, very close to these levels, has experienced. China and North Korea, on the other hand, look more like developing countries, but still, China has definitely come a long way. A few demographic generalizations about East Asia. First of all, besides the low fertility and high life expectancy, as Ito said, there is a high ethnic homogeneity, a nationalist history, and a low social tolerance for, at least in the past, for migrants. And that's particularly the case in Japan. Japan has had migrants, a large number of them from Brazil, and it doesn't accommodate them very well. And they were second generation, third generation Japanese, in fact. Japan and South Korea and Taiwan also, and China as well, have had kind of backdrop of a Malthusian perspective about resources. And this is not something that's overly palpable, but something that comes out. I mean, if you take a look right now, China still maintains what might be called a 1.5-child policy, despite demographers insisting that, in fact, low fertility has become part of the backdrop of the social backdrop of this country. And they also have a significant residual gender inequality that, though it's changed quite a bit, and perhaps Japan has that issue that it has to grapple with, and I think it will grapple with it as labor becomes more scarce. Just to look at the age structural transition, this is what we're talking about. If you look at the bottom of this graph, this is the percent 65 years and older, and on the vertical axis is the percent younger than 30 years. And all the countries of the world are thrown up on this graph, and there are little points. And this is the direction of the age structural transition. It follows the demographic transition, the decline in fertility and infant mortality. Up on the corner are countries with a very pyramidal age structure, if you can read that. Those who don't know about age structures, this is the proportion of the total country that are males and females, infants and toddlers being at the bottom, and then older people being thrown up on top of them. And the more pyramidal age structures typically, as research shows, have real problems with political stability. That's where about 80% of all civil conflicts arise, up in the left-hand corner. And as you move down, countries typically become more stable, but they, as I think Jocelyn pointed out, because of the demographic bonus, it's sort of the sweet spot of the age structural transition is in the middle, and the challenges are at each end. So at the beginning of the transition, you have problems with very rapid workforce growth and the ability to employ these people, to educate people. As you move down, you're looking at a future where in the middle, it's a very comfortable time. It's a good time for the state, as one say. But at the ends of this transition, what you have is, some have called a sort of, I forgot the term actually, all of a sudden. Sort of an incongruence, an inability. The state was not designed for this, basically. That a contradiction, that's the term I was looking at. A contradiction with the state. That is, the state was created with the fixed borders, with the population, not really thinking about what was the future. That wasn't part of the design. And then here are these contradictions. The one is at the beginning, and the other we're sort of moving quickly into it in an industrial world and in Northeast Asia. A contradiction with the welfare state in particular. The things that we laid aside for people, they may not be adequate enough. And here's, we can run through the age structural transition in an example of Japan. Very youthful in 1935, somewhat belligerent as well, internally. And then 1970, demographic change has already occurred. Replacement fertility in 1960. The age structure changes. There's an echo here. And if we, in 1990, it arises. In 2025, using the median projection, we have a very narrow base and a high proportion of people, almost 50% by that time, are in middle age and seniors. Taiwan, very youthful in 1965, goes through a fertility decline in 1990. By now, as of 2000, its fertility drops from 1.7, which was around replacement, a little lower than replacement, to 1.2, and now 1.1 according to the U.S. Census Bureau. And it also takes on this shape in 2025, probably, according to the median projection. And South Korea, nothing too different. A little bit ahead of Taiwan. Youthful, 65, 1990 has already changed, 2010 right now. Still in the sweet spot of its age structural transition because most of the people are in the working proportion, in the middle section of the age structure, and therefore are capable workers, well educated because South Korea decided to spend that money, its tax dollars, smartly. Median age has been increasing. Japan ahead, South Korea, Taiwan, China, and North Korea behind them. And finally, we take a look here at the recruitment pool. I'm talking about the age group among males that are typically recruited or conscripted into the military. Japan has gone through these waves. These waves were created by the echoes in their age structure, and now is in decline. But this decline is just, and level, is about the number of 18 to 25-year-olds that were eligible or available at the time of World War II. So we're going back to these levels. We're not, the fertility is still very low, so these will continue to decline unless things change. I've only gone out to 2030. I think that's all that's reasonable at this time. And South Korea is as well going through a decline. Taiwan is as well. But if we put it in terms of what China is going through, take a look at this. I mean, first of all, China's 18 to 25-year-old cohort is huge. Its fluctuations are as large as the entire populations of 18 to 25-year-olds in Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan combined. So no one's going to take on China on a land war. Nobody thinks about it, and it's largely about the future in military readiness in this region is all about technology, and it's all about human capital. If we look at East Asia in terms of military personnel, we can see why there's really no demographic theory of defense. I mean, maybe that was good in the days of Genghis Khan when everybody was a soldier, but the mouse roared. We have weapons of mass destruction, we have technology. It continues to be, it will be about making the most of fewer people and with fewer dollars. And if you take a look at this chart, here are the number of active military personnel in Japan, Taiwan, South Korea, China, North Korea, and these are active reserves. And what compels political entities to amass large numbers of reserves is security, is their perception of security. Security trumps economics everywhere. And you can see North Korea, I've used the base as the 18 to 35-year-old males in the country. Well, North Korea has in its active reserve 181% of that group. Now, obviously, this is a military state. Older adults, younger adults, women are in this group, are inducted, conscripted. But South Korea isn't doing bad at all. 74% of that group are in some form of active military or active reserve role. As far as Japan, that's a very small amount. The percentage, that's right, yeah, okay, that's what I explained. Taiwan, 60%. So these are countries that feel that they must maintain a posture that's ready to defend their soil, and they spend a great deal of money on it. Defense spending, highest in China. Japan is below that, and then you can see Taiwan and South Korea, North Korea. This is billions of US dollars. Put in perspective, US military spending is over 600 billion. So just to give you, put that into perspective, that's them, this is us. And defense spending per working age person. Now things start to look a bit reasonable. There is, across Japan, Taiwan, and South Korea per person, the spending isn't too much different. It's low in China. It's actually quite high in North Korea, considering how much, what that economy is like. So you can imagine what a burden this is. And for Japan, China is the big spender. 4.3% of its gross domestic product is spent in military and is increasing. Japan is the lowest, 0.8%, hardly spends much of its currency on, its GDP on, or its budget on, on defense at all. Some final thoughts. The three pressures. What's really going to push these countries in the future? I'm suggesting. I realize that there's going to be economic and pressures that, besides the demographic pressures, the difficulty balancing the social safety net with defense spending. But we're at a period when we're experiencing the rise of China, and these countries will respond. They're not going to just walk away from this. They can't afford it to. So I'm suggesting what you're probably going to see is almost like Bostrop's theory of environmental capital, of land, that they would go through, that people would intensify in order to deal with a sort of a base that was held fixed. The same thing could be thought of about human capital, that countries with limited budgets and with limited personnel would, this pressure would be to intensify the use of human capital to educate their military personnel as well as they could, to push forward ahead of adversaries' technology, buying it, making it. The U.S. will probably be a supplier. And third, there'll be a pressure to resolve differences among allies, regional and global. That is, I think we're going to see a Pacific Rim that will be mobilized to counter China's rise. And that will include these three countries and probably Vietnam, Indonesia. There is, what we're looking at is maybe analogous to the Cold War. The end of World War II, weakened European states, threat of Russia, U.S. organizes NATO. Rise of China, perhaps a slackening of East Asian economies, perceived need to have a nuclear umbrella that's supplied by the U.S., plus have the U.S. involved in sort of fortifying their military posture vis-a-vis China. So that's, you know, the typical analysis of this is that, oh, we can't spend any more money on defense. I don't see that happening. I don't think that's the case. I think what we'll see is intensification. And that will mean both, as I said, technology, human capital, personnel restructuring, which is very important in East Asian militaries. They tend to be top-heavy. They're places where people spend lots of time. They stay there as enlisted personnel and lower-ranking officers into their later 40s and 50s. That will end. These people will largely be retired. More international involvement of these militaries, training exercises. You saw South Korea just a few days ago take on the Somali pirates between Oman and the coast of India. That was, I think that was unusual, and people should take note of that. It's an international, you know, a deep water presence for South Korean Navy, and done very effectively. And then, as someone mentioned already, women. Women have been a feature of the demographic change as fertility has declined and as women have been freed up from the house, as labor has become short. There's been labor shortages. Women have moved into the workforce. They were a big contributor to the manufacturing workforce in East Asia, in Indonesia, and Thailand, and Taiwan. Militaries will open up and use women for, as we do in the West, and as perhaps even as the Israelis do. They'll find women as good managers and as well as good enlisted people, and we'll see more of that, and that will be a big change for East Asia. And I'll end right there.
Okay, we'll open the floor to questions now. Here's one.
And you both reached the same conclusion about the role of migration to kind of offset the demographic issues. Can you tell us, each of you, about the nature of the public debate about immigration? Because I think that, especially for Taiwan, it's probably slightly different than the situation in Japan and Korea, because in Taiwan you have, migration is possible from the mainland, but that raises a lot of political issues in Taiwan. But with respect to South Korea, where is the immigration coming from? And in the case of Japan, have you seen an evolution in the last years about the acceptance of immigration? Because I know that it was very, very controversial. So is there a shift in attitude with respect to that?
What would you look at that? That doesn't matter.
Migration isn't exactly my core study. But from what I know, that in Korea and in Japan, they're two of the most homogeneous societies in the world. And so I showed you the figures that Japan actually has net inward migration. But most of these people come from Korea, I think, and they work in what's known as the KKK jobs, which are the Bryce, you'll have to remind me the dirty, dangerous, and the smelly jobs. So I don't think there's a lot of acceptance into the formal labour market of these people. But whether or not migrants can also be used in aged care facilities, I think there'll be a growing need for that. That's about the extent of my knowledge on migration.
Thank you. The migration issue in Northeast Asia is a really new emergent issue. And I think it comes in very many different forms. Just to sort of premise this, Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan have hitherto been one of the non-migrant countries in the world. In other words, they have historically considered themselves as a migrant sending nation rather than migrant receiving nation. And indeed, even today, both Japan, even with the net inflow of migrants into Japan, the foreign population still represents only something like 2% of the total population. So you're talking about pretty small slice of the population group. But the real problem is the potential of that pictures changing. And where things are happening are in a couple of places. In the case of in these three countries, there has been an increased inflow of people coming in from Southeast Asia. In Japan, lot of inflow is coming from countries such as Indonesia and the Philippines. Many people come in still now under the category of the entertainers, but also there are sort of openings for people coming in as care workers. Indeed, in 2008, Japanese government did make bilateral agreements with the Indonesian governments to bring in these special categories of temporary workers in the elder care sector. This is rather strict immigration policy. Very few have come in, but what it does is basically wedge open that door for the future sort of intake of the migrant workers. All this is in preparation for the prospect of labor shortage in that area. In the case of South Korea, they have changed the immigration and multicultural policy last year. The government now has opened sort of new immigration policy reform, allowing Joseonjok, which are the Chinese and Russians of Korean descent, to have the special privileged and extended working visa in Korea. So that's happening as well. And indeed, I actually have a PhD student who has been studying the Joseonjok workers in the elder care sector. In the case of Taiwan, a lot of Filipino workers have come in as the family care workers through private arrangements. So there are immigrations happening. Aside from this, there are also another category of migrant inflow into these countries, and that's through the categories of the foreign spouse. And so in the case of Japan, that process began in the 1990s, starting with Korean women, Chinese women, and then gradually, increasingly extending the reach to Southeast Asian spouses. A lot of these spouses marry older men in rural area who have to who are sort of left out of the marriage market, who tend to be farmers, unskilled, and who have to look, who have to begin to worry about the care, finding ways to care for their aging parents and for themselves later on. So that's the direction and that is going. Korea, significant inflow. In fact, currently the international marriage constitute 30% of the total marriage in Korea. Most of those, the international marriage happens to Korean men and Southeast Asian women, particularly Vietnam. And then in the case of Taiwan, similarly, very high proportion of international marriage. So you could see that there are the migrations are happening on two fronts, both on the labor market front, openly, as specific temporary care worker category, and then in a private front through the foreign international marriage. Yes. In Korea now. Yeah, yeah.
Amazing.
It's unbelievable because it's quite
New marriages or
new marriage. Yes,
yeah.
sorry, new marriages.
Yeah.
Yes, new marriages. Yeah.
Okay, just before we get going, I'd just like to make an announcement. It is snowing. The snow is not sticking on the ground yet, so we'll keep thinking. We'll probably wrap up about 5 o'clock instead of 5:30, if that's okay.
Sorry, my first question is to Jocelyn and a comment to Richard. Jocelyn, when I see numbers like 1950 demographic data on China, for example, and at my age, I was alive in those days, and China in 1950 just finished this 5 years after World War II, and this huge civil war they just took over. I don't think they had a national census data for, whatever that you put, especially when it comes to people over 65. I don't know if the average lifespan in China at that time was 45 or 50. So I would look very careful. Also, South Korea for 1950, right the year before the huge war starting. In fact, it started in 1950. So I would look at those data very carefully. I think in that area, only Japan had demographic data at that time. So that's one comment. In terms of what Richard was saying, I think there is a strong, when you look at the history of that area, I think Japan is more closely culturally and everything else related to China, say, than it is to the United States. It's the anomaly of the last 60 years that and also the modernization of Japan, that Japan is affiliated more to the West, and especially in the last 60 years to the United States. But all things considered, it could change. And in fact, I think it's changing already in terms of commerce and in terms of education. I think if you go to Japan, there are about 200,000 Chinese students in Japan already. If you go to convenience stores in Tokyo at night, most of the people working there are Chinese people. And and who knows, they welcome, Japan, I think, welcomes the rapid economic growth of China because a rich neighbor is better than a poor neighbor. And I don't think that everybody in Japan is looking at China as a threat. It is something that we might embrace.
But that was the accommodationist perspective that went on since World War II. And I think a lot of Japanese politicians are wondering, where did it get us? So, and the question is...
We are to a very second largest, one of the highest economy, most civilized countries in the world, with no war, very low military budget,
Right.
and a model for the rest of the world.
We shall see.
Shall I respond quickly? So I think it's a very important technical point that you make. But so the figures that I get come from the World Population Prospects, and as you point out, China hasn't had a comprehensive census as far back as 1950, and certainly has had a lot of upheavals between 1950 and 1970 through to 1980. But so the censuses, I think, is 1982 and 1990. And so what the World Population Prospects do is that they take the current, or at the year of the census, the age structure of the population. Not only do they project forward, as we saw the figures that I put up through to 2050, but they would also project back. So based on projections of fertility and mortality rates, they then, and the current age structure of the population, say in 1982, they then project back to 1950. So it's a good point that the figures that I put up would have been based on projections. Yeah.
But, Dave, let's not make Bob get...
Yes, Dave Fitzgerald, retired State Department, now a consultant. I'd like to go back to the question of that was in some of your presentations about this sense of pressure that's coming, and the questions of nationalities, the ethnocentric mind thinking, especially in Japan, Korea, perhaps to a certain extent in China too, and the not only demographic but the global economic pressures. I mean, we talk about the need for childcare and healthcare workers, but I mean just for competitiveness of businesses and the ability to bring the best people from some other place into Japan or into Korea or into China to replace the people in China that aren't up to speed, you're going to need a different type of nationality. And you have had for 2,000, 3,000 years a mindset in those countries that identifies a particular ethnic group with whatever they are, whereas an American or a Canadian isn't necessarily anything. It's just a place name.
Mm-hmm.
How do you deal with that challenge?
Well, I'll give it a try. Yeah.
Demographic.
Mm-hmm. I think you have hit the nail squarely on the head, and it's something that actually Richard had alluded to, and that is the problem of institutional incongruity. And I think for me, what that means is that these countries, the basis of these countries' economic success was premised on a few key competitive advantages. One of that was demographic. The other one was a sense of national identity built around the fact that they're single nation, homogeneous, coherent, cohesive society with sort of common mission and future and goal of which is economic growth. So and so they were very successful throughout the post-war era in doing that because they have healthy, young, very well-educated, increasingly well-educated population that worked hard, high productivity. Problem is that as the economic as their economy became strong and industrialized and modernized, other other social and economic institutions also began to change as well. Things like ideas of gender equality, ideas about individuality, the choice, the equality, the idea about having life, having work and life balance. That doesn't go very well. And as a result, some parts of the institutions have moved ahead. Women, Japanese women, Korean women are now highly educated, want to have careers and these things. Other institutions, more specifically, business institution has been very slow, and they have not been able to provide the kind of work environment that would accommodate these women with high human capital resources. As a result, they're creating blocks, sort of barriers against these women to succeed. Now, I would think from the business and politics, government point of view, the smart thing is to kind of begin to look at these sort of incongruous institutions and say, okay, what would be our new strategy here? Because obviously the old strategy doesn't work anymore. Demographics are not the same. People's ideas and mindsets are not the same. Families are not the same. So how can we capitalize on what we have and begin to really mobilize and use the new human resources?
This lady here, she already has a microphone.
Is it on? The switch is on the bottom.
On the bottom. There's a small grey switch. Here we go, Bob.
I'm from Population Strategies Group here in the United States, and I'm interested in hearing you talk about something that's clear in European countries, many countries, aging populations, lower fertility rates. I have a sense, listening to the talk, that there's some feeling that it's not a good thing that's happening. And my question is there a problem with the total amount of population in a country and the world? And my second question is, if there is a problem and these societies are facing this, which is very obvious, I don't hear very much about what the solutions would be. I don't hear you talking. It seems to me, what are we going to do? How do we adjust to these changes? You just began talking about them. Are people studying that? Are you studying it?
Yes. There was a conference just before Christmas over in Austria on optimal fertility. And I wasn't able to attend, but I asked my colleagues, so what's the answer? What's optimal fertility? And they're like, oh, well, there's not really an answer. And I think about this all the time, and to me it's the trade-off between what's the optimal number of children versus what's the optimal population size, because the fertility rate today then evolves into coming to some sort of equilibrium population size in the future. Do we want to decrease the population sizes now, or do we want to see a stabilization of population sizes from now on, or do we want to see a further increase? And then depending on what you want, then that will determine what your optimal fertility rates are. As an economist, I would say the population size just doesn't matter. So in terms of the constraints on natural resources, then prices should fix that. And so if there's a strain on natural resources due to an increase in population, then we'll just see an increase in prices for those. But the non-economist in me says that, well, we do have to pay attention to natural resource usage, and we do have to be careful about sort of exploding population sizes. And I do a lot of work in Africa and seeing the population sizes expanding there, looking at the cases of, say, Nigeria, where they have very high fertility rates still. Population size is still increasing year after year at an exponential rate. What are all these people going to do when they hit working age? What are they going to do now? So I think that there's the non-economist in me sees a great problem with exploding population sizes. And seeing that some countries have declines in population, I'm yet to see some some scientific evidence that there's a problem with that. Nations as a whole may have a problem with that. Seeing your country shrink is not such an attractive thing for a politician or a leader. But from an environmental perspective and a sustainability perspective, you can continue to ask the question of maybe it's not such a bad thing.
Yeah. Can I? Yeah, I'd like to. I'm going to say pretty much the same thing. I think, you know, I've worked on these issues quite a bit, and I came to the conclusion that population size matters for resources, or it matters for the environment in particular, and age structures matters for the state. In other words, it's the state that is very sensitive to the number of dependents, the growth of the workforce, demands for different particular elements of the labor force. But generally, it's been very insensitive to the size of the population. In fact, politicians love a larger population, and in terms of state power, it seems to work as an advantage. We just have to look who gets the seats in the UN, and they're big populations. But and then you see who's screaming. It's typically biologists. Why? Is because it's never been very good for nature as we know it, ecosystems as we know them, natural ecosystems, if there are any left, and as we consume more, as individuals consume more, it will get worse. So we don't see any way out of this, particularly with population growth. So it's a nice way for me, at least, to think about it: the state and age structure, the environment and population size, and then every once in a while they seem to meet sometimes, maybe in terms of water. It seems to meet. But really, the state has been very good, very competent at going elsewhere for the resources it needs, or making do, or creating institutions that regulate these resources when push comes to shove.
Great. Okay, the gentleman in the red sweater there.
Thank you. I have some observations. First, I was intrigued by the KKK because in Korea it's DDD, dirty, disgusting, dangerous, and Southeast Asians do those jobs. So I find it peculiar that Koreans are doing that there. And about the Koreans call it the Kyopo visa. Mm-hmm. So actually it's not just Chosinjok, but okay. I'm of Korean heritage and I can get that visa too. Okay. And what's intriguing maybe for Professor Sinkota, if I said that right, mm-hmm. is that a lot of Korean women or families try to get their babies born in Guam or in U.S. airspace so they can avoid the Korean conscription. But one thing that really, in this panel, that has a lot of my focus is the Korean birth rate. And one of the things I've heard, the Korean government, I mean, anecdotally I know this, but I'm sure the evidence can be found. But there was a Korean national PR campaign telling the Korean public to have less children. And I think the rationale behind that was to increase the savings rate, so I've heard. And now we still have a low birth rate, and Korea is a thriving economy. Korea is no longer, I mean, I think one of the things Korea was trying to prove with the G20 is to say we are a major global economic player now. Still, there's low birth rates, and Korea recognizes this as a big problem. And as you said, Professor Peng, they have tried introducing a lot of incentives. But one big social problem Korea has, and even the current president's been trying to grapple with it, is the huge cost of education. And even if they go to public schools, and I think at a certain point, even a public school, you have to pay some fees, there's a huge cram school system. And I think there's something similar in Japan. It's expensive. It's super expensive. And also Korea is the largest, sends the most number of students to the U.S. Mm-hmm. And there's these stork families where the guy stays in Korea and the whole family lives in the U.S. so the child can get a U.S. education. And that's extremely expensive. So from what I've heard from Koreans, that is a big incentive or disincentive to have children. And I think, I don't think there's any policy incentive the Korean government can create that would counter the cost of education. Thank you.
Yeah, actually, my own question is, in terms of specific policy, I think Jocelyn mentioned, and Professor Peng, you implied that pronatal policies simply have no effect. Can anybody explain why that might be? I know we've talked about changing moral values of society, but is that really all that it is? Like, for example, I know that Japan has actually pretty extensive childcare policies. Have they worked? Haven't they worked? Is there any difference there? What's going on?
I think actually Korea too has introduced quite impressive sort of family support and childcare policies as well. And to make things even more interesting is that the current president, who is quite conservative otherwise, has redoubled that effort to support families and ensure national child care. Now, I think one of the problems, and this is something that we have begun to talk a bit earlier, is that these policies are quite instrumentalist. This is a policies aimed, these are the policies aimed precisely to incentivize women by removing barriers for women to work, to reconcile their work and family responsibility. It still rests, that much of the onus still rests on the women and family. It does nothing to the workplace environment. It says it gives no peep to the employers, except for a mild suggestion that they should really give the support for the young workers, particularly women. So long as the two different, here I call institutions, on the one hand, the policy and government and social institutions say, well, we have to support gender equality, we've got to give family more incentive, we have to do this or do that, give more childcare. And then there's work and business institution saying business as usual. We expect all our full-time employees to be working, 65 hours a week. Then it doesn't work. And I think that seems to be the research outcome, that they're not able to raise their fertility rate.
I think in myopic societies, like Australia, cash advances have actually been quite successful in increasing the fertility rate. So that policy has actually finished now, but it was ranging between $3,000 and $5,000 per child, and that it was successful in increasing the fertility rate. But the increase in fertility rate was really by 0.3. And so you think of the monumental decline in fertility from rates of 6 or 8 in 1960 and down to now 1.1 in Korea and Taiwan and Japan. You're not going to see this kind of reversal. But in the likes of in Northeast Asia, I think they've even tried cash advances. I know in Singapore they've tried cash advances. But I think Professor Peng really pointed out that there's a very complex relationship between the roles of the women in the home versus in the workplace. And I think this complexity is not overcome by a simple $3,000 or $5,000 cash advance, as it would be in societies where those limitations on women working in the workforce, as well as taking care of children, don't exist, as in the case of Australia. So,
Yeah. In Europe, I guess there's a few models of countries that have at least not declined as much as some of the southern European countries, and have actually begun to rebound. France is one of them, and then Norway, a couple of the Scandinavian countries. I don't think it may be too early to tell, but the conclusion of some people is that, first of all, as the French have done, the environment for children is much better everywhere. In other words, everyone, private enterprise, public, the malls, everyone is participating in making it easier for kids to go into restaurants, to do everything do whatever, to be a part of everything. And that certainly isn't even here in the U.S. Secondly, in Northern Europe, marriage has basically fallen apart. As an institution that is a necessary element for building a family, it just does not exist anymore. Women have children out of wedlock very, very I think it's approaching 60% of in Scandinavia. So there's no, and then you juxtapose that to, say, Southern Europe, where the institution of marriage is very important, where you don't raise a family without it, then it becomes a constraint. So if women are able to either live with someone, or even if they raise children by themselves, in Northern Europe, they seem to be educated enough to raise these children themselves, and they don't feel like they need necessarily to have this institution constraining them. Many of these women do eventually get married, but some don't. So maybe that is where this is going.
Sonia.
Sonia Michelle for the Wilson Center. I have one question for Professor Peng and then one for Dr. Finlay. For Professor Peng, I understand when you're talking about changing the work, these two institutions of the government and business, but what about the culture within families? Is the household division of labor changing at all? Or is that another disincentive to women to have children? Are men giving up their expectation of having a complete dinners or whatever, and children all washed and polished and ready to be presented by their working wives? Is this happening at all? And the question for Dr. Finlay, the question that came up before about population and the sort of optimal fertility rate, I wonder if demographers are beginning to think about, most of the discussion about fertility and demography in this discussion has been within national boundaries. It's been on a national scale. And I wonder if people are beginning to think about this more transnationally and the ways in which migration is sort of redistributing migration, populations across the planet, so that these high fertility countries like Africa are sending so many people to the low fertility countries. It's partly because that's where the jobs are and there's an economic incentive. But I wonder if people are, thinking at all about the sort of eventual worldwide redistribution of population. And conversely, are they thinking about the ways in which the migration of so many women from the global south to the global north is creating not just a brain drain, but a care drain on those populations and undermining development goals in those places?
Yeah. Thank you. I'm very glad that you pointed out about the family culture and situation within families. I actually just finished a very large research project with the UN Research Institute for Social Development in Geneva that looked at 8 countries, the situation of demographic change, care, social policy responses. One of the research that we did was actually to examine the time use surveys from all these countries. And what we see very interestingly, particularly case of Japan and South Korea, where the government introduced all these fabulous policies, in the case of Japan since the mid-1990s, and in the case of Korea since the end of the 1990s, what you see in terms of the sort of average amount of time men and women spend in the unpaid care work has not changed much. So there's something happening within the family that's not moving as fast as people's mind are moving. Now, saying that, what we did see, because this Time Use survey sort of have waves every 5 years, so we could only take a snapshot of every 5-year change. There has been small but significant changes in the younger cohort group, in which the men, and particularly when you crossed with men, educational level, you find that the male cohorts in their 20s and 30s with higher education tend to spend more time than their cohort group in the previous waves in terms of unpaid care. So there is some ideational changes happening, but it's really slow. So that's a question answer to that. Migration, did you want to?
Yeah, I think the international migration compensating for the decline in fertility is an excellent policy suggestion, but the realities of it have certain limitations. So it would be great to see this huge increase in the working age population, say in Nigeria, all being mobilized and able to work in places where they're really lacking a working age population. But if you consider the limitations in terms of not only the recipient country, in terms of maybe cultural barriers and issues of acceptance, which we have seen exhibited, particularly in the Northeast Asian countries, but also from the sender's side. So the Philippines is very well structured and enables their women to be trained as nurses, and they're trained in the Philippines. They are internationally accredited, and then they go abroad and they're up to the international standard of whichever recipient country they're going to. So unless countries can establish these education institutions with really targeted industries and use Philippines as a very good model for that, then I don't think we're going to see that internationally so much. I do have to say that in Africa, there's a lot of migration within the African continent, particularly of men. So I do a lot of work in Accra, in Ghana, and one of the problems there is that there's no men, and there's a lot of women-only households, women with their children, and it's just that the men have migrated out to go and find work, often within the African continent. So I don't think that Africa, where would be an obvious pool of young people, would come from. They're not adverse to this, and but maybe we need to help them establish institutions to educate the people to an international standard of where the recipient countries want to see the migrants.
Could I just add to that? Because I think what you point out is absolutely true and very important. I also wanted to point out, say that, I mean, your idea about, sort of migration as possibly a way of redistributing people from high fertility area to low fertility area, I think that's really wonderful if in the ideal world, if it happens. So maybe, I don't know, every Canadian could adopt a child from high fertility area and do that. But I think the problem here is that the form of the migration, and maybe that's what you were pointing out, is not that democratic nor equal. That these migrations are highly selective and coming from a certain place to going to certain places. I would more think of it in terms of the redistribution or accumulation of human of the new resources, which is human resources. And so what we see in terms of the pattern is not the sort of equalizing of the world population, but concentrating of certain capital, which is some feminists will call it the new form of resource extraction from certain region of the world to another, carried by migrant workers. Migrant workers are the vessels of these new forms of resource redistribution. And so, places like the Philippines, where the government is parts and parcel of this, when you have over 10% of your GDP coming in form of remittance, it is important for that country, and therefore the country actively promotes that kind of mobility. But clearly the payback, the payback of this is the fact that you are that you will be losing a lot of these skilled women, many of them with children back home, to be cared for by who? So I think we need to look at it more sort of seriously and closely.
Can I stick in one quick one? Let me put a little damper on this one because speak up for the state, because that kind of migration is occurring, and if there were Europeans then in here, they would start to scream, because it's easy for America to talk about open migration and because we have a long-term experiences. We're all migrants in the long run, but Europeans have a notion of a state that's very much identified with an ethnic background, a history, a religion, a language, and their experience with migration and low fertility at the same time, most Europeans would say is very negative. That being that as with very low fertility, you can expect, with a constant migration and with people not integrating, that is, staying in with their own community, they will replace, it's a mathematical principle, they will replace the ethnic majority. And it happening very rapidly in Europe, and it's not a pretty thing, because it is not only created communities, perhaps because of the way Europeans have handled it, and not the migrants, but nonetheless created large communities where there is a belief that religious law is better than listening to what the state has to offer, that women and family, that they can handle their own family law in religious terms within those communities, and that the state has no jurisdiction over women in those communities. And finally, it is reinforcing the building of a right-wing reaction. So it's something that Holland, the Dutch are dealing with in particular, but also Denmark. So on one hand, it seems like a very splendid idea. On the other, on the ground, and with this idea of a state, and with these identities, it's just not turning out in the way you might think it should.
Okay, great. I think we're going to wrap it up there, because I did promise that we'd get away a little early today. If you do have any questions, please feel free to come up and briefly ask our panelists. Thank you very much, and could you join me in thanking them?